Hi everyone, welcome back to Professional Development for Creative Practices. This is going to be our second lecture. We're on the first part of Unit 3, which is we're going to talk about legal agreements. This is in terms of contracts. How do we basically enshrine a set of promises with someone else in a way that's enforceable but also protects us? So we're going to be covering the first part of a two-part unit on legal agreements. So let's jump right in. All of the content for this course, including this lecture, is on the GitHub wiki, which will be linked in the description for this video, or you should be watching the embed of this video on the actual site, which is you can play this and follow along, etc. If you're in my class, you should be used to this by now, hopefully. So let's jump right in. This is Unit 3, Legal Agreements. Get it in writing. So how do we make agreements concrete and legally enforceable? This is a pretty essential part of creative practices. There's just a litany of stories, and we'll go over some in this unit, but there's just so many stories out there about how signing up for a bad contract really screwed someone over, screwed them out of money, they got sued, their business went bankrupt. Contracts can be a little scary. So what this two-part unit serves to do is introduce us to the concept of contracts and how they are legally enforceable. Kind of goes over some common elements and some good advice. And then in the second part of the unit, we're going to talk about things like negotiation and what to do in the case of a breach and how do you protect yourself. Basically, different ways to utilize legal agreements for your creative practice to help empower you, which is a major theme of this course. So we're going to, that should not have started over again. Still getting used to this. So what we're going to start off this unit is we're going to talk about kind of our definition of legal agreements. So let's jump back into the website. And I enjoy this GIF. YOLO. So let's talk about standards of legal agreements, which is the first section, and we're going to talk about the purpose of agreements. Now, legal agreements, they give us the ability to lock a promise into place in a format that can be readily understood, interpreted, and potentially enforced by a third party. Listen, our memories are faulty, and it can be dangerous to take people at their word. What we want is, whenever we agree to something, we want it to be in a format that can be understood by a third party. Commonly, when I say third party, I mean a court of law. So what's our basic definition of legal agreement? So a simple definition from the Oxford Dictionary is a negotiated and typically legally binding arrangement between parties as to a course of action. Now, for the purpose of this class, I've kind of modified it to mean the following. A legal agreement, it's a set of promises between two or more parties that's enforceable under the law. So a couple of things to remember there. It's a set of promises. It's not just a singular promise. It's a set of promises. For instance, let's say it's an employment contract. With an employment contract, you're going to be receiving a wage. That's one type of promise. There's going to be a location that you work at. That's another type of promise that you'll show up to this location. If you don't show up, you get fired. It's going to talk about who's in charge. It's another type of promise. These promises just keep building up on each other. So remember, a contract is very rarely about one single thing. It's usually a set of promises. And then again, between two or more parties. And when I say a party, think back to our last unit of business formation. One party could be a corporation. So it could represent a whole bunch of people, but they're considered a singular party in a contract. So you and I could have a contract. I could represent a large corporation, and you can just be representing yourself. Even though there's many people, there's only two parties. So it's important to understand who the parties are in a contract. And there can be more than two within a single contract. There can be multiple parties. And then there's this idea of being enforceable under the law. Now, when I say law in the context of this unit, I'm talking about U.S. law. Again, this class is encapsulated around the ideas of US law. I just can't get into international law without broadly, completely blowing out the scope of what we're going to really cover. So now that we have our simple working definition, I want to kind of jump into that idea of legal enforceability a bit. And I want to actually get into this idea of obligation versus something being legally enforceable. So you're going to see that the terms contract and agreement, they're used super interchangeably. At the top of contracts, you'll see something, it'll say like, oh, employment agreement, or it'll literally say employment contract or sales contract or like royalty license. There's all kinds of things that can appear at the top, but because these terms are used so interchangeably, it can be confusing for people when first learning about legal agreements to think like, well, me and my friend just agreed to do this. Can that friend sue me now? And it's this idea of obligation versus something that's legally enforceable. So to start with, there's this idea of like just having a simple agreement. So simply agreeing only creates an obligation between two parties. So you can have an agreement but not be legally bound to those terms. So the example I use is, you and I, we agree to meet later today and discuss the terms of a project. This isn't really a legally binding agreement. I'm only obligated to meet you. There's no real repercussions for me if we don't meet. It's just an obligation. Yes, it is an agreement. We agreed to meet at a place and time. But if that doesn't come through, we are not bound to any course of action after that. We're not really legally bound under the law to do anything. We're just obligated to each other. But, also don't ditch me. I'm a wonderful date. You should meet up with me. I'm great. I'm fun to get coffee with. I'm entertaining. Don't fall through on your obligation. Anyway, so the next is a legal agreement. And when an agreement is recorded, that is often what is referred to as a contract. So you're going to hear me say agreement and contract very interchangeably. But a legal agreement creates an obligation as enforceable under the law. So let's go back to our example. You and I agree to meet later today. And we're going to discuss the terms of a project. So we have a purpose for this meeting. You and I agree in writing that if you or I don't show up, you're voiding your role in the project. I can go find someone else to work with now. Anything we've agreed to up to this point is voided because you didn't show up to discuss the project. Now, if you come after me and you're just like, hey, I was dependent on that money for this project. How dare you drop me from this? We had an agreement. And I could point and say, like, listen, like, you can take me to court. We agreed in writing that if you didn't show up, you voided your role in the project. That's a little bit more of the idea of having a binding agreement. It's more than just an obligation. The set of promises can be enforced in a court of law. So, what do we want legal agreements to accomplish? Oh, we skipped it. Don't look at that GIF yet. What do we want legal agreements to accomplish? Well, at a very bare minimum, we want our contracts to accomplish at least the following. We want to clearly define who the parties of the agreement are. Now remember, a corporation could be a singular party. So when you're signing a contract with someone, even though you're signing with a person, understand who the party is. People can change. They can leave jobs. They can get fired. They can go away. But the contract remains. So if you sign a contract with a corporation, you are signing it with that corporation, not the person in front of you. So you need to understand who the parties are. How many parties are there? Which party is representing whom? These are things you want to know in your contracts. The second thing is you want to define the terms of the arrangement. What are you agreeing to? We're going to talk about this a lot. In the case of contracts, brevity is not a good thing. You want specifics and you want specificity in contracts. You want to know exactly what you're agreeing to do with someone. And you also want to know what you're not agreeing to do. You will see this in contracts where we'll say like, okay, this contract does not cover the following. And it lets people know what you're not getting into an agreement with them over. what you were staying away from. Be like, okay, this agreement is just between me and you. This is not an agreement between me, you, and my company back there. It's just between the two of us. It excludes them. That is defining the terms of the arrangement, helps define who's involved. Let me come with an example that's about parties. So let's say that, here's another way. Defining the terms of the arrangement, it might be time period. You might say, okay, this contract between us is for 1 year. Nothing beyond that year matters. 1 year. That's an important thing to the arrangement. You don't want to sign contracts that just go on forever. And then the third one is we want to create a legally binding arrangement, something that's enforceable under the law. Not every contract is automatically enforceable. Many times you will contract with someone and it will be something that is outside of the scope of like a state or federal law. Like you can't actually contract someone to do something. So you always want to be sure that you're creating a legally binding arrangement with your contracts, but it's also just something you want to be aware of. You are going to be in a binding relationship. Okay, so let's go on to the next section. Let me get the title up here real quick. So now we're going to talk about elements of an agreement. So we're going to talk about the essential elements that you should be aware of in making your agreements and what kind of makes them legally binding in the first place. Let's go back to the website. Nice little Gandalf gift there. So the 4 elements. In order to create a legally binding arrangement, you actually need like a shockingly low set of requirements. You only really need 4 things to make a legal agreement. You do not necessarily need a lawyer. You do not necessarily need to have a contract professionally written by a lawyer. You do not necessarily have to do a lot of things to make a contract. You can just agree to something with someone else, and if you have at least these 4 elements, it could bind you in a court of law. So let's talk about those 4 elements. First one, the idea of legal intention. You must have the clear intention to enter into an agreement with a party and to abide by the legal consequences of that agreement. And we're going to talk about this a little bit later in terms of creating documentation. But what's basically saying here is you can't you can't like pretend to marry someone on stage and then have someone think that you and the actor is actually married. You weren't intending to create a legal relationship. And, we can do things like, so a lot of times you want things to be verified by like a public notary, or maybe you have to agree to things in court or at a certain office within a regional or state office. There has to be witnesses. A big part of this is the idea of establishing that legal intention, the intention to create the legal relationship. And we'll get into that, but it's an important part of this. It's an important aspect. You have to make sure that both parties are very aware they're creating a legal relationship. You want to have an offer. There should be a clear, detailed offer as to what each party will provide or what action will be taken as part of the agreement. This is what it sounds like. If we think of like a sales contract, for instance, it's like, I'm going to give you a piece of artwork and you're going to give me money. And ownership will be transferred at that point. That's an offer. Now, in line with the offer, we have the consideration. And a consideration is essentially what's at stake in the contract. Money, property, control. So let's go back to the sales contract idea. What's in consideration is the artwork and the money received. That's the consideration. So if we enter into a sale, it's like, okay, I'm going to sell you this artwork. So I intend to I have legal intention. I intend to pass a piece of property to you and receive compensation in return. My offer is $5,000 for this single piece of artwork. So the consideration is the $5,000 and the single piece of artwork. And then we have the final element, which is acceptance. Both parties must clearly accept the offer for the contract to be considered fully executed, or basically agreed to. Both parties have to accept. It's very essential. You can't have just a one-sided contract. Both parties have to accept to make it legally enforceable. If both parties don't accept, it's not legally enforceable. So that's it. That's what you need to create a legal agreement. It's very, very bare minimum. Now, whether or not these things hold up well in court, whether or not they violate state or federal standards, that's going to get it. We're going to get into later with more of the complications. But this is basically what you need. You just need like these 4 things. So there's an important thing I want to get into, which is one of the major danger with contracts, and this idea of written versus verbal. So contracts can be 100% verbal. It's a really dangerous thing. Like I said, if you have the 4 elements, you can form a verbal contract. Think about like something simple, like you agree to pay a high school student to mow your lawn, and you're going to give them $20. And the high school student says, great, and then mows your lawn, and then comes to your door knocking, asking for the money. It's like, you're not going to write out a contract for that, but is that a binding agreement? Yeah. There's an intent to create a legal relationship. You're temporarily contracting a high school student to mow your lawn. The offer was on the table, so it's mow the lawn, you get $20. The consideration was the service and the money that came with it, and both parties accepted. It's a verbal contract. It's enforced. It's difficult to prove in court, though. That's the danger with verbal arguments. They're very hard to prove. They're really nasty if you don't have a witness present to verify what you both agree to, because then it becomes a more of like a they said situation. Some protections against verbal contracts or getting yourself into them is that there are certain things that can only be done in writing. So, for instance, if you're going to transfer property, if they're a transfer of like real estate property, like a house, if you're going to marry someone, if you're going to obtain a business license, that has to be done through written contracts. A lot of times that falls to federal and state law as to what those requirements are. So best practice, I always say you should negotiate in person, negotiate verbally, but always then agree in writing. Make the agreement in writing. You can always ask to lock an agreement into writing. Let's talk a little bit about witnesses and documentation. So I kind of already said this, but a lot of times, especially with verbal contracts, but definitely with written contracts, you want to have a third party witness the signing of the contract. That can help attest to the intention to create the legal relationship. So here's some examples. A real estate deal often involves a closing company, a neutral third party that verifies all the documents in the property sale. So they sit there and they verify everything that's being signed, everything that's being done, and they're just there to verify. In a marriage ceremony, the officiant is witness to the union between 2 people, and usually they sign the marriage license. I'm actually an officiant. I've actually done 2 weddings at this point, and I have had to sign the marriage certificates as one of the official witnesses. And then also, when you commit a major sale, some parties, when you do a major sale, like let's say you're selling an inventory of cars, that's a pretty major sale. Some parties will use a neutral broker to verify the elements of the sale and the signing of the sales contract. And that person usually gets a fee out of this, like a brokerage fee. So most often, how do you get a witness? How do you get a witness to a contract? A lot of times it can be done using what's called a notary public. Notary public is an official of integrity appointed by the state government, typically by the Secretary of State, to serve the public in an impartial witness, blah, 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 blah. You can read this, but basically they are an official witness. They stamp the documents. They check to make sure that you are the actual people signing the documents, so they'll ask to see your ID, things like that. It's usually a very affordable service. And a lot of times documents will require being notarized for the very reason to make sure that you intend to sign this document. Okay, so that's, we know how we get into the contracts, but a real quick word on how we can get out of them. What invalidates a contract? Just makes it automatically not valid, doesn't work, not legally enforceable. So that's the idea of invalidation. And there are 3 big types of invalidation right off the cuff. So the first type of invalidation is the idea of enticing criminality. You cannot contract someone to do something illegal. How is it legally enforceable if it's an illegal act? So enticing criminality is one. The next one, this is a very important one, is the idea of lacking capacity. So people that are minors or have mental deficiencies cannot enter into contracts on their own. They have to have a parent or guardian help them and sign on their behalf. Why? So they can't be taken advantage of. And then finally, this one's kind of funny, just because of the Godfather image. It's the I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse thing. You cannot threaten people into signing. So agreements cannot be made under duress. You can't, you've heard the phrase put a gun to someone's head. You can't literally put a gun to someone's head. It will invalidate the agreement. These are defenses you could use in a lawsuit or in a or if you're taking to court. These are defenses you could use to help invalidate abusive contracts. Are they perfect defenses? No. Should you definitely consult with a legal professional? Absolutely. Everything I'm talking about here, this is my generalized knowledge. I'm not a lawyer. You should be checking this against legal counsel. So in general, I like to say have 5 rules to remember. We're going to get into a lot of other things in later sections of this unit, but in general, 5 general rules I like to tell students in terms of contracts. Never sign a contract without reading the entire document. We have all signed contracts without reading the entire document. If you have ever signed up for iTunes or any type of software with the terms of service, and you just scroll through it all, then click I agree at the end, that's a contract. You're agreeing to a contract. I don't read them. Do you read them? No, but if it affects your creative practice, you should not be signing without reading an entire document. Because remember, you are agreeing to everything that's in that document. You need to know what you're agreeing to. Second, never sign a contract if you do not comprehend the entire document. It's a lot of legalese. It's a lot of confusing stuff. You know, what does indemnify mean? What does assignment mean? Like, what do all these concepts mean? If you don't understand, get someone to review the contract with you, not the person you're signing with. Get someone who's familiar with contracts, familiar with that industry, or in the best case scenario, legal counsel, to help you comprehend what a clause means. Again, once you sign it, you have agreed to it. So you need to make sure you comprehend the entire contract. Number 3, never succumb to the pressure to sign. It's a tactic. People will push you. You have to sign this now. There's no time. This is standard. You know, there's no such thing as a standard contract. People say like, oh, this is our standard contract. Well, it's standard for them, but you're not necessarily a standard person. You know, you could be unique. It could be a unique situation. Never succumb to the pressure to sign. Always read and comprehend the full contract. Excuse me. The best time to start a project is the moment the contract is signed. Does this happen in reality? No. People start on good faith. And I understand that. And the industry is hard. And sometimes, you know, things get ironed out later. But the best practice when running a business, you don't start doing work for them until you have a contract signed. And remember, you only need 4 elements. It could be as simple as an email chain to create a legally binding agreement so you can start work. So you make sure that you have some defense to make sure that you're getting paid, know what your rights are. All of that should be set within an agreement. And then finally, don't take terms on faith, take them in writing. People will make promises up and down, left and right. They'll promise the world. But if it's not in writing, they're not actually going to provide it. They don't have to provide it. It's all just fluff. If it's not in the contract, it's not enforceable. So that's so we're going to go back to section 2. Let me get my chapter marker up. Oh, no. Here we go. So section 2, contracts and creative practices. We're going to start off discussing some common contract elements. Let me do that. Or sorry. We're going to start off talking about common contracts. So what are some common types of contracts? Um, they cover the gamut. I mean, it's basically anything you can think of commercially agreeing to someone with can be put together in a contract. It could be something like a sales contract, which is what it sounds like. It's determining the sale. It says things like price, what's being exchanged, what the parties are agreeing to. You do this all the time. Every time you go into a store and buy something, you get a receipt. What is that receipt? Proof of the contract between the two of you. You bought a candy bar, you exchanged money, now you own the candy bar. What do you get? A receipt as documentation of that. When you sell your artworks, you should be signing, at least basic sales agreements with people to let them know that you're passing that property over. You know, a lot of times, this will also involve things like I have a friend that basically gives people price quotes. And when you sign the price quote and then agree to the quote, that's kind of like the starting process of the contract for the sale or the service, which leads into service agreements. If you're a freelancer, if you're signing up to work for someone as an independent contractor, you're going to be doing a lot of service agreements. That determines things like what's being made, when you're getting paid, what's the budget, what's the timeline. Tons of stuff we're going to get into gets encapsulated into service agreements. Equipment lease. You could lease your equipment out to make money. I have a friend that owns a very expensive robot arm. It's like a $45,000 robot arm. Not everyone that wants to use a robot arm wants to buy one. So she chooses to lease it out. And so she's able to get rental money for that. But you want to have stuff into an equipment lease. You don't want to just hand it over. You want to say like, okay, hand it over. Here's how much it costs per day. And if you damage stuff, you have to pay for the repair. Those are the kind of things you would package into that type of contract. Mortgages, that's for real estate. You're agreeing to take out a loan in order to buy a house, and you're going to pay the loan back over 30 years. Non-disclosure agreements, NDAs. This comes up a lot. You'll be discussing, so you're an artist and a major technology company reaches out and they want you to do something cool and viral. And in the discussion, they say, listen, before we can even sit down and talk, we need you to sign an NDA. And you're just like, well, what's an NDA? And it's like, well, they might be talking to you about products that aren't publicly released yet. And so what they want is an agreement that you're not going to go around and blab. So that's a non-disclosure agreement. Employment contracts, that's another one. When you have a job, the parameters of that job should be set out in an employment contract. What are you getting paid? What are your benefits? That's locked in. Loan agreements. You take out a loan, you have to sign an agreement that you're going to pay it back and at what interest rates. Mergers, when two companies come together, tons and tons of promises there that need to be set. Business formation can be a type of contract, especially if it's between you and a partner. You're going to agree to form a business. That should be done in a contract. Insurance coverage is what it sounds like. A company is agreeing to provide you insurance for a set fee. That gets outlined in a contract. License and royalty agreements. If you want to license out your work and then have it charge money or have it generate money for you in the background through passive income, that can be done through a royalty agreement. Property transfers. Representation's a big one. If someone's going to be your agent, if someone's going to go out there and be your employee, if someone's going to go out there and just be your talent agent, your business manager, whatever, that kind of representation absolutely should be locked into a contract. So there are clear set parameters what these people can do for you. Okay, next up, we're going to talk about some common elements that you're going to see in contracts. So real quick, I'm just going to cover some basic things that you're going to see pop up a lot with contracts. This is not an all-inclusive list, but these are things that you should be seeing in most contracts, especially service contracts, the type of things you would use if you're going to be a freelancer. So right off the bat, parties. Who is the contract between? Who are you signing up with? If you do, let's say like you agree to do a contract with Google, and then you sit down and you're signing with some weird LLC. You're like, well, this isn't Google. Who is this LLC? Why am I signing with them? Clearly understand who the parties are. Maybe the LLC is a contractor with Google, and you're subcontracting through them. And that might be a surprise to you, but that should be clearly laid out in the contract, who the parties are. It'll be right at the top. Term. What's the duration of the contract? How long is this contract? Is it ongoing? Does it end at a certain point? Are there key dates? A really smart thing people do when they make contracts for services is they build in dates and milestones. So they say at the signing of the contract, I get a 50% deposit. Halfway through 1 month or 50% of that project complete, I get my second payment. And when this happens and this happens, they set things in time. They put milestones. They put key dates. They lay it out so it's very clear. Also, what I was saying about you want the contract to end, you don't want things to just go on forever. If a contract is going to expire, that's when you renegotiate. This is very common with union contracts. When people form labor unions, the labor contract is usually like on a 2 or 3 year basis. So like every 3 years, that union is renegotiating with the employer as to the new contracts. So there's a time limit. Purpose, what it sounds like. You'll see this as statement of work, terms of service, engagement. Basically, it's answering the question of what is this contract for? What's the scope of work? It's very, very important that you're very clear and detailed in these areas of contracts. If you're designing a logo for someone, great. What comes with that? Are you giving them a logo file? And you're also giving them a whole bunch of different sheets of how the logo can be used? Is it a full package? Also, do you hand over the intellectual property as well? What is all being considered here? What's the full scope of work? That's in the purpose. Sometimes they're in contracts, they will literally be labeled purpose, statement of work. Sometimes it's just mixed in and you have to look for these elements. Payment and price. How much are you getting paid? That's one. That should definitely be in there if there's a contract where there's a payment. The second part is something that more and more creative practitioners need to do. How and when will you get paid? So what's the format of the payment? Are you going to send them an invoice and then receive a check? Is it going to be like a direct deposit situation if it's an employment contract? Like when and how are you going to get paid? Do they have to pay you every 2 weeks? Do they have milestones they have to hit to pay you? Is it a 50% deposit right up front? You want payment terms in there. Things like employment status. Are you an employee, a contractor, a purchaser, a seller? This should all be outlined. You want to know what your status is. Very, very common in every type of freelancer and employment contract. There will be a line that clearly states you are an independent contractor or you are an employee of the organization. You want that to be clear. We're going to cover why that's super important in the labor unit, but that should be in there. Ownership and transfer. Is there intellectual property involved? Are you transferring those rights? How and under what conditions does that transfer happen? This is especially important when we're going to talk about intellectual property. If you're going to give over intellectual property to someone, once they have it, they can run with it. This is a tool, and this is going to come up in our general guidance part of this unit. This is a tool you can use to get people to pay you. You can say, yeah, you know what? Transfer of the intellectual property rights to what I've made for you happens when I receive full payment. So ownership and transfer, it's what is being transferred over, what is being given to them. Again, talking about the logo, it's like you make a logo for them. Or do they just get a file? Or are they going to get, the logo and all the drafts and all the drawings and, all the conversations recorded and blah, 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 blah. Like this stuff should be outlined. Indemnity and liability. What can you be held responsible for? And are you able to be compensated for losses? Basically, this is risk. How do you reduce risk? Something goes wrong. You make a sculpture and you sell it to someone and the sculpture falls on someone and hurts them. Are you responsible for that? Depends. What does it say in the contract? They could install your sculpture incorrectly and that's why it hurt someone. But you want to have in there when you sell them the sculpture, hey, you know what? This is a big, heavy sculpture. By agreeing to this sales contract, you agree that if anything happens, it's on you. It's not on me. Penalties and damages. If you break the contract, are there consequences? And are there limits to those consequences? Sometimes people will put in contracts things like, okay, if there's a breach of contract, it's a $5,000 penalty, and that's the limit. That might be a nice thing to have in a contract because you don't want someone to sue you for every penny that you have. So what are the penalties and damages? What are the limits to them? You can also do things like you could build in a fee if someone does a late payment. Or let's say someone cancels the contract halfway through the work. You could have a termination fee. You could be like, hey, you ended this contract early, you have to pay me. Assignment. Can a party assign the rights of this contract to a third party? Assignment's a little bit of a crazy thing. Basically, you and I get into a contract. I decide I don't want to do it anymore. I assign my role in the contract to some big corporation you've never heard of. Am I able to do that? Well, that should be covered in the assignment section of a contract. You don't want to get stuck into a contractual relationship with someone you didn't intend to be with in the first place. I mean, I just use Google because it's a giant company, but let's say like you and I got into a design contract and you were developing designs for me. And then I decide to sell the whole project off to Google. And I assign my role in the project to Google. Now you're in a contractual relationship with Google. Assignment's kind of a crazy thing. And we're going to talk about this in class when we review a contract. Arbitration or governing law. How are disagreements settled? And we'll go into this more when we talk about breach, but it's basically like if something goes wrong, what happens? Does it immediately go to the lawsuit step? Not necessarily. Sometimes you meet with a neutral third party who helps you figure it out. And also, what body of law will be used to interpret the agreement? So let's say you're in New York, I'm in Pennsylvania. What body of state law is this contract being made under? Is it being made under New York or is it being made under Pennsylvania? That should be in there. Also, especially important if you're dealing with international parties. Renegotiation and renewal. Can you change parts of the agreement after you sign it? And then if the contract period expires, can you renew it? Is renewal automatic? That's a dangerous one if renewal is automatic. But basically, just because you sign a contract doesn't mean you can't renegotiate. What's the result of a renegotiation? Another contract, a new contract, a better contract. Those type of things can be put in there. And also, if you don't see stuff in a contract, you can suggest that things get put into them. Contracts are between two parties. Severability and termination. Man, this one is so important. I saw this online. I saw a Twitter thread once where it was like, what did someone wish they knew about contracts? And someone immediately responded, it's like, I wish I knew how to get out of them. It's the first thing I wish I knew. How do I get out of a contract? You want to know how you can get out of a contract, what can invalidate the contract. It's not just what we talked about earlier about the thing where it's like if you have capacity or under duress as invalidation. There are other things that can invalidate contracts. Let's say you sign a non-disclosure agreement and then you disclose stuff. Wait, no, that's breach. Okay, you sign a non-disclosure agreement and it's about keeping a product secret. And then the company releases the product to the public. So it's not really a secret anymore. It kind of invalidates the contract in a good way. But you want those kind of things labeled. So like, okay, I'm in a non-disclosure agreement. Once this product goes public, am I going to be able to talk about it with people? Oh, yeah, that's fine. That is in our severability and termination. Like, how do we, Also, termination comes up in employment contracts a lot. How can you be fired and for what? And then special provisions, it's a dumping ground. Always read through special provisions. It's all kinds of weird little things they throw in there. So really check through that. It's where you'll see stuff that's not covered by like standard elements within a contract. It's a crazy Wild West. Pay special close attention. Okay, let me go back to my marker. Okay, now we're going to take a quick look at some examples. Where's my... Oh, there we go. we're going to take some look at some examples of contracts in creative practices. So, examples of contracts in creative practices. Before kind of getting into some of the general guidance and then the future units on the more complex parts of defense and breach and all that other stuff, I kind of just wanted to help give some context to what we're talking about. There's millions of stories out there about bad contracts, but I picked a couple in particular just to kind of give us a good idea of kind of the reach and creativity that you can have with contracts and creative practices. And all of these are linked on the course site. Excuse me while I navigate back over to my window. Do this, and then here we go. Okay. So I really like this piece. It's called A Tool to Deceive and Slaughter by Caleb Larson. What I like about this is, so basically it's literally a black box. I mean, you can see it like right in the image there. It's a black box that connects to the internet. And when it's connected to the internet, what it does is it's programmed to sell itself on eBay. And when it sells on eBay and you buy the piece, you actually have to adhere to a pretty strict purchase agreement. And what that purchase agreement says is when you buy it, you have to plug it into the wall and allow itself to sell itself again. It's an ongoing sale. And you know what? If you want to buy it, you have to agree to that. If you don't, then the sale is valid and the artist takes the piece back. So the reason I have this is that, oh yeah, you can also, you can actually read the full purchase agreement there. It links to a PDF. It was prepared by a law office. It's very official. It's really genius. But the point I'm trying to make with the Tool to Deceive and Slaughter is that contracts don't have to be just about the boring stuff. You can lock in artistic intention with a contract. You can use a business skill to really hone in and solidify something that you want to do artistically if it involves other people and other parties. This is especially important if you're an artist. Like, let's say you're shown in a gallery and there is a very, very, very specific way that your work must be shown. Maybe it's under certain lighting. Maybe it's with certain audio considerations. Maybe it's how many people can see the piece at once. You can put those parameters into a loan agreement. And then if the institution wants to use the piece and put it on display and they sign the loan agreement, they have to adhere to these guidelines that you set forth. So contracts can be powerful tools for artists. This next one I love. So Laurie Spiegel's Harmonices Mundi. I think that's how you say it. I'm terrible at saying this stuff, pronouncing things. So Laurie Spiegel had a musical work that was going to be included on the famous Golden Record. It's a collection of music and sounds put together by Carl Sagan and launched on the Voyager spacecraft. This was in the 70s. So they put a bunch of different sounds and recordings and music and all kinds of stuff onto this Golden Record, like screwed it onto the side of a space probe and just fired it off into space. It's somewhere beyond our solar system now. Like, it just left our solar system, I think, in the last 5 years. So as part of that, as part of this like amazing interstellar work, when Laurie Spiegel was commissioned, she had to sign a contract with NASA. And so there's this interesting clause in it, and I have the clause pasted here, and I'm just going to read it real quick. NASA shall have the right to use, reproduce, perform, sell, and distribute the work, which is in this case is the musical work, or any portion thereof, in any and all media without limitation throughout the world and extraterrestrially, in and in connection with the above-mentioned Voyager recording, and any and all reproductions thereof, and to authorize and license others to do so. What this basically says is NASA has a lot of power to share, reproduce, perform, do all this stuff with Laurie Spiegel's work. What I love is that Spiegel crossed off throughout the world, just crossed off that phrase in the contract. NASA signed the contract. What does that mean? NASA has the rights to it off-world. On Earth, Lori retains all of her rights. Does it sound like a trick? Does it sound crazy? Contracts are insane. The language is super important. When you read through something, completely comprehend it, because when it comes to being enforced or being looked at by a third party, they're going to check that language closely. And so, like, this is an example where someone who is very smart with their contracts just crossed something off they didn't like. It changed the meaning of the clause to her advantage. This next one is kind of depressing. Gary Friedrich, who created the comic book character Ghost Rider. So he was asked to sign a one-page contract handing over all of the rights to what he created to Marvel. So he created this character and it was handed over in full. Marvel completely and totally owns Ghost Rider. So why did he sign this? Well, because when talking with Marvel, they promised him future work. They said, you know what, you do this for us, and we're going to keep hiring you to produce more characters and more comics and all that stuff. So he signed this very brief contract, and you know what? Marvel never hired him ever again. What's the problem? Marvel's promise to hire him further for more work was not in the contract that he signed. He could have insisted that said, okay, you know what? You want this character lock, stock, and barrel? You're promising me more work? Well, then you need to put in the contract that you're going to commit to 10 more commissions of mine. Oh, by the way, here's what I want to get paid. Oh, I think the recording stopped. No, hopefully it kept going. So the lesson here is, you know, if contracts are, there's two lessons here. If contracts are brief, probably a sign that there's stuff being left out. And what's being left out is wiggle room for the other party. They're able to claim things or get out of things. But the big part about this story is to make sure that when someone promises you something as part of the deal, that needs to be in writing. The next one, Anish Kapoor and Vantablack. This is kind of an... I love this one. It's so weird. This company called Surrey Nanosystems created the blackest substance ever manufactured. It's so fucking metal. It's like 99.6% of light is blocked by Vantablack. It's just the darkest thing. It's the darkest thing that's ever been made. Internationally renowned artist Anish Kapoor, he obtained exclusive rights to use this material for art. So this company signed a contract with Anish Kapoor. Only Anish Kapoor is allowed to use Vantablack in art. This pissed a lot of people off. He claimed rights to an entire material. And like, what even defines art? You know, but it's like contracts, man, they can be really, really powerful tools. You know, also what I love, there's an artist who got so pissed off about this, they made the pinkest pink. And in the purchase agreement, it says that everyone's allowed to use the pinkest pink except Anish Kapoor, which I just love. Okay, I'm going to go back to my marker real quick. And finally, to kind of just wrap up this unit, I'm going to quickly point to some resources on general contract guidance that I think you should watch on your own time and at your own leisure. So, general contract guidance from creative practitioners. There's two videos here that I think are incredibly important in giving you good context. Both videos involve very articulate lawyers who are really good at explaining complex concepts, especially the ones we've gone over so far in this unit, as it applies to people in creative practices. That was a junky sentence I just said, and I am sorry. So first, we're going to go back to this video I played for the people taking my class. I played it at the top of the class for funsies. This video by Mike Montero, Fuck You, Pay Me. It's an hour-long video, well, 38 minutes, not hour-long, video about signing good contracts, protecting yourself, not leaving money on the table, I've kind of broken out some different uh, bullet points. These link to the different parts, different lessons throughout the video. We'll probably discuss and watch this in class, but this is a really good video to watch and get some context. And in addition to that, there's this video that someone sent me a while back with Chantel Martin's YouTube channel, Artist Advice Episode 00. And what I like is it's a discussion, it's an honest discussion between Chantel Martin and Jonah, and I'm sorry if I pronounced that name incorrectly, Jonah Williams, an entertainment lawyer, I believe it's entertainment and intellectual property lawyer. It's a lot more specific to intellectual property, but there's a lot of good lessons in here as well, and it's an enjoyable video to listen to. So I think check these out. Definitely watch the full videos at some point. It's not a required assignment, but I think it's good for your own education. And then kind of just to wrap up real quick, how do you get access to a lawyer? I keep talking about getting legal counsel. There's a couple different ways, but you want to do things like you want to seek recommendations, talk to your network, talk to your family, talk to your friends, see who they use. A lot of times lawyers will give you a quote. They give you an upfront estimate of what a service will cost. It's not all about like having a lawyer on retainer and spending tons and tons of money. Sometimes you can go to a small business lawyer. It might cost a couple $100s to put together like a business formation contract, but you know what? It's really worth it. And then specifically for artists, there's this thing called the Volunteer Lawyers for the Arts program. This is where you can get pro bono legal advising on a specific subject. This is usually run through local arts councils. So I've linked to the program in there. And then where can you see examples of contracts? There's just tons and tons of contracts we talk about, but it's like, well, you don't have that many. How can you look at what's common in the industry? There's two resources here. One is Law Insider. It offers access to millions of contracts. You can search by industry. You can search by use. And then also this website, FindLaw, I really enjoy. It's a really, really good learning resource. They also have a ton of contracts, and they go much more into the weeds, explaining the different concepts we've talked about. So that's it. This is the end of part 1 of our legal agreements unit. Part 2, we're going to get into breach, enforcement, and litigation. And then we're also going to talk about the negotiation process, which I think is super fun. So, all right, everyone. Talk soon. Stay safe. Oh, that went up again. I need to learn how to do title cards. But yeah, stay safe and don't get into bad agreements.